legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffitt, and my guest today is Thomas Sheridan, who joins us to discuss the film Penda's Fen and related themes and topics. In 1974, the BBC broadcast the film Penda's Fen, leaving audiences mystified and spellbound. Make no mistake, we had a major work of television last night, the Times declared the next morning. Written by playwright and classicist David Rudkin and directed by Alan Clarke, Penda's Fen follows Stephen, an 18-year-old boy whose identity, sexuality and suffocating nationalism unravels through a series of strange visions. Set in the village of Pinvin against the backdrop of the Malvern Hills, the film is an evocation of conflicting forces within England past and present, and most of all, its mystical, ancient pagan past. After its original broadcast, the film vanished into unseen mythic status, with only a single rebroadcast in 1990 sustaining its cult following. With a DVD release in 2016, Penda's Fen has now become totemic for those interested in England's deep history, folklore and landscape. Hello and welcome, Thomas. Thank you so much for joining us again today on legalizefreedom.com.
Always a pleasure, Greg. Delighted to be back.
Now, what we're doing today is actually at your suggestion, and I can't remember, I think I finally bought the DVD of Penda's Fen, which is what we're going to be talking about, that and related matters. And I think I must have posted something about it online, and then you suggested we do this, because I know that a lot of the themes in it are of great interest to both of us. But when I went back and investigated, I mean, I was aware of this film. It was made for TV. But I was thinking, well, how did I miss this one out? And then when I got a couple of books on hauntological matters, I realised how much TV and film I'd missed. You think you've got a pretty good grounding in this stuff, and then something like that slips under the radar. Worth mentioning, though, that for years and years and years, Penda's Fen was, in many ways, it's the definition of a hauntological piece, but in particular it was because you couldn't get it. It wasn't even broadcast the time it was made, so it didn't show up on YouTube until about 2008, and prior to that I'd just seen a trailer for it, so it had that air of mystery about it. I don't know when you first managed to check it out.
I only heard about it in about 2016. I read the review of the DVD had been released with, remastered HD DVD, and which I bought subsequently, a little while later, but they were praising this thing, saying it was one of the greatest, works of television ever made, ever produced, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't really go deeply into it, but it definitely got my interest. And I found that it was an appalling version on YouTube with lots missing and loads of tracking problems. It was obviously someone had found it somewhere and put it on a very bad VHS tape, but it was good enough to say this is like one of the most remarkable things I've ever seen in my life. And then when I got the DVD a little later, I now believe that Penda's Fen is probably the greatest piece of television ever produced. And I say that like without hyperbole. I really do believe that it's up there, if not the best.
Well, as I mentioned, there was some controversy about it after it was made. Partly, I think even the people involved in it didn't really know what they were making, which they were kind of like channeling something, but it wasn't broadcast. It was broadcast sometime after it was made. It was taken off the schedule, and it wasn't shown again on TV until 1990. So I think what you were probably looking at, that really ropey version, was somebody's VHS tape from that time.
I think that's true, yeah.
Now, Alan Clarke directed this movie, and when I was reading up, reminding myself about his career, I was reminded he's made several films that I rate very highly. I know I mentioned this to you yesterday. There's two, Scum, which is about Borstals, which is basically prisons in this country for youth, as it were, but, serious offenders. They are rough places. Made in Britain was his film about skinhead stroke racist culture, not tying those two things together at all, but, obviously in the 1970s there was that subculture. And The Firm, which is a sort of a gangland film with outstanding performance by Gary Oldman. And also Rita, Sue and Bob too. I don't know if you've seen that one, but that's great fun. It's basically just about the tedium of suburbia and what people do to get themselves through it.
All I've seen was Scum, which is brilliant, and was actually made into a Hollywood movie with Sean Penn called Bad Boys, which is also excellent.
Oh, I didn't know that. I'll have to check that out. Yeah, so Penda's Fen was originally part of a series Play for Today on the BBC, and Scum was actually also made as part of Play for Today, but along with one called Brimstone and Treacle, which was later made into a movie with Sting in it. Both Penda's Fen and the same Brimstone and Treacle were pulled from the schedule originally. And, but really it's something that's, I would say, in the early 21st century's found its place. And I don't know about you, but when I watched it again, only just for a couple of weeks ago for the first time ever, I didn't find it that difficult to follow or to understand. There were some strange things happening, which I don't know where they fit into the story. But I was expecting it to be less comprehensible than actually it was.
When it first came out, Alan Clarke was saying that the BBC literally were throwing money at anyone who wanted to make anything different. And there was a very open-minded agenda at the BBC in terms of the drama department, and particularly through Play for the Day, that if you had an idea and it was basically radical, quote unquote, you got the money to make these things. And he said they were surprisingly, free and easy with the money, but they didn't always broadcast them. So it was almost a case of perhaps they paid for them, commissioned them, and if it didn't get broadcast then, well, down the road they could broadcast it later, or perhaps release it eventually through videotapes or whatever when that format came out through their commercial department. But that's why it came out. Now, you're right about it not being well, let's compare it to the other Play for the Days. I can remember those kitchen sink dramas, as they called them. They often tended to be very Ken Loachy, very cliched, to do with class warfare, often from a very socialist point of view. The working class and the Jeffrey Osborne don't looking back in anger kind of theme nearly in every single one of them. But Penda's Fen was completely different. It was completely off the wall compared to what was, the standard Play for Today fare. And I think that was the main reason why I don't think it flew. Although you said it's easy to follow, and it is, but it dealt with themes, coming from the world that you and I inhabit. We watch alternative documentaries. We watch, we read books that are kind of not mainstream, and it's 2000, it's past the 2000s now, and the internet has made a lot of information accessible. But this would have been literally a smorgasbord of occultism and esoteric information hitting the mainstream viewer when it came out in 1974. And I think on that level, it was probably a bit too out there and a bit too cerebral in terms of the Times mainstream viewer to broadcast. That's what I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was the prog rock era, wasn't it, I suppose, and the moving into the punk era. And while there was, certainly you could see it reflected in other cultural artifacts and trends in the 70s, while there was a sort of expanding consciousness on one level, the 70s was also, and this was reflected actually in parts of America as well, particularly New York, wasn't it? It ended up being a very depressing decade, despite all the great things that came out of it. I mean, most of my favourite movies are made in the 70s, actually, and that says something. But yeah, perhaps people, even though I find those kitchen sink dramas you refer to, the Ken Loach stuff, as like really disempowering, it almost seemed like people, and this is why people still watch soap operas today, isn't it? They almost want to feel better about their lives by looking at how much shittier someone else's life is, even if it's fiction.
Conversely, Penda's Fen is very empowering in the other direction.
Mm.
It actually deals with spiritual transformation outside the domain of, the prevailing Christian orthodoxy of the West.
Yeah, very much so. In the story of the boy, again, if people are planning on watching this, they should probably leave listening to this talk until after they've seen it. He basically, the young lad who's the protagonist, starts out as super conservative, mainstream, mainline, preppy, vicar's son. Everything about him just, apart from his kind of nascent homosexuality, everything seems to just fit as far as where he's going in society. And through this relatively short film, you see him beginning to question values, and he actually thought the values handed to him by society were his, but he begins to realize they're not.
Stephen was a parson's son, not a vicar, as he says in the film. And that shows how, uptight he was. He was very anal retentive and very pedantic. But at the same time, too, even at the very beginning when he's listening to Elgar and he's looking over the countryside, he had this deep spiritual resonance to him. And afterwards he's thinking about the Elgar's music, and from a viewpoint of an English Presbyterian in that part of England, which actually is another character in the film, is that part of England, that area between Birmingham and Wales. And so you see the kind of the roots of something deeper there. But he confuses animism with patriotism and Christianity, and I think that's his main problem.
Yeah, he's a very intense young man, and that early scene you mentioned with his mother interrupts him listening to his album, you can see there's tension there. I mean, you might say it's not uncommon for teenagers, but this guy is intense in a different way. And so I think that was always within him. That's really who he is. But again, he was adhering to these values and what was expected of him, and actually superficially embraced it. So the film was like some kind of him having some kind of psychic or psychotic break. But ultimately ends up, I think it's, a very positive message for him. And you can see the potential for his future of how different his life is going to be as a result of this episode, and how he has a chance to be himself and be fulfilled in ways that, even down to his sexuality, that he just couldn't in that buttoned down disciplinarian environment that he was part of, mainstream establishment all the way.
But even though he was this snobby little preppy public school boy, I still found them, even when I first saw the film, even in the early parts of the story when he's tormented and confused by playing with the convention or the orthodoxy of the time, there's something likable about him. I don't know whether it's because he has this look in his face that he's not a little shit, put it that way. His attitude problem is caused by the fact he has no friends, is probably academically gifted in the true sense rather than the educational sense. He's also a musician. He also has a great deep affinity for music. So he's not unlikable. The young actor who played him and the character, he's one of those kind of people you come across in your life that you feel like they're pushing you away, but there's sort of like a good soul in there, and it just has to be kind of watered and brought out. In his case, it's two things. He's watered and fertilized by his remarkable father, who I think is some of the father's dialogues, the Parsons dialogues in the film, are some of the most spectacular pieces of dialogue ever put into any kind of work of broadcast art. And also the journalist that he befriends, the sort of left-wing radical Trotsky journalist, playwright he becomes friends with. And that's what he is. He's it's like what James Joyce said about he was the conscience of his race unborn. And he was like the conscience of his repressed self unborn. But it wasn't out of malice or it wasn't pathological. He was complicated, but not, and that's what keeps you watching the film and not hating him.
Yeah, because certainly there's a potential there. If you describe the character, you could see some people who have maybe seen the film would just think, oh man, he does sound like a little shit, but that's not the case. And you're right, and you're kept. I found the thing increasingly gripping as it went on, actually. And when it ended, what felt to me suddenly, I actually said out loud, I was sat here on my own, I said, oh, that can't be it. Is that it? Not because I was disappointed with the ending, but I was just disappointed it was over. You know, I was wondering where it was going to go next, and then it stopped. Because
he had walked off into well, we won't tell people, but we all know what happens at the end when he calls out to a god, but not the God of the Bible, and has a religious experience. Well, not a god, to an ancient pagan king. But yeah, that was it. He was actually cured before that. He resolved so many other things, like the fact that, and if you haven't seen the film, you really need to switch off the video right now, because there's no way Greg and I can get through this without having lots of spoilers. But he had already solved the issues of his real parental history, and his fact that he wasn't English. I think the parents were Irish, actually, and Catholic. And he had sorted that stuff out, even when he went to see the playwright's wife and discussed with her about adopting children and saying they'd make a wonderful parents because they're interesting people. He already got that out of him. It was the final thing at the end was when he has that kind of epiphany, but it's quite violent and disturbing, that when he has that epiphany, it's done. The door is closed. It's like I see the end of the movie as like when a relationship ends, there's no further drama. The person closes the door behind them and walks away, and the two other people go on with their lives. And that's how I see the end of the film.
Yeah, well, it's Penda from the titular Penda who appears at the end of the movie, the last pagan king of England. He was around in the 7th century. And I think that's probably, for me, that was kind of like a high point. And that's maybe why I was kind of a bit crestfallen when the film just stopped, because I kind of figured he was going to be in it more. But yeah, some of the dialogue is just outstanding. You mentioned the boy's father, the parson, but also that Trotskyist playwright that you mentioned. I mean, when I was listening to him speak, it was like poetry. And it didn't rhyme, but it was like some kind of Shakespearean speech, and it was just how he expressed himself. It was almost like he was reading lines, if you see what I mean. And as an actor, he was, but as the character, he was just so eloquent and so not the person you thought he was going to be when we were at that town hall meeting and he's arguing with probably the Tories.
Well, that's the scene, the town hall meeting, that like takes you watching this film, and this whatever it is, a play, and transforms you into it. It's like that scene in that, when I first saw that scene in the town hall meeting where he's saying things like, and it's incredible considering the world we live in today. He talks about the countries ruled by incredulous psychopaths. Had anyone ever used the word psychopath to describe politicians back in the 70s? And yet here it is, blatantly used on this film. He talks about he used the term hideous angels of technocratic debt regarding a secret underground base. This is where the kind of hauntology, Quatermassy, it's got this sort of like salute to kind of Quatermassism in the film, with this underground base that's not really heavily gone into in the actual story, but nevertheless it's an important part of it, because he talks about later on about military always seem to build, with the father when he becomes the parson, how the military always seem to build these hideous places like Los Alamos and Penda's Fen, these hideous places of death on sacred pagan ground, whether it be Native American or whatever. And it's, like you said, it's just you want to know this guy in real life. It's like I'm sitting there and you say, I wish he wasn't an actor. I wish he lived down the road from you. We could be mates. That kind of a thing.
Yeah, the phrase he uses regarding that bunker is haunted sites, which I thought was an interesting choice of words as well, because that doesn't necessarily, in that context, I don't see that as negative. I just mean in terms of like a lingering presence, you know. And there's a great bit of dialogue that he does with the playwright when he's, what is it that lies beneath? You know, he's giving the impression that really, a bit like some of the Christian church builders, you know, the original ones building on pagan sites, that these military and boffins and these technocrats and these practitioners of scientism are really not, you know, need to be very careful with what they're messing with. That's the impression I got. And also the impression of all of this is a transitionary thing, you know, that the past is the future. You know, you guys, you know, the technocrats, the people we're talking about, you know, you think you've arrived at, you know, to quote Francis Fukuyama's ridiculous book, The End of History, you know, you think it isn't over, you know, and the future could be just as mythical and magical as the past. Yeah, you're just here for a little while.
Yeah, and also the underground is also a subtext for Stephen's own repressions, his own hypocrisies. There's a scene prior to that where he's in school and it's like a debate in the class, and he's complaining about a BBC or TV documentary about the real Jesus Christ. And he starts off by saying that, like, Britain is the freest country in the world. We don't have a police state. We have freedom of press and so on. And there's no censorship. And then he goes on to praise an injunction against a TV show documentary that investigates who the real Jesus was because it's heretical. So he's full of hypocrisies. And the purpose of the playwright is to almost become, along with his father, but the playwright, the father's more kind of a cerebral therapist, you know, ad hoc therapist of Stephen, while the playwright is delivering more of a shock doctrine. The combination of the two are allowing him to mine the architecture of his own subconsciousness to discover who he actually really is.
Yeah, there's various phrases that I think I'm probably pulling these from the essay, the booklet, which accompanies the DVD, has an essay in it. And it's speaking about England, what it actually is. And it actually, for all this illusion of stability and illusion of safety, and you see this coming through with Nigel Neal's Quatermass stuff a lot, you know, just this superficial, everything's all right, but beneath it. So psychologically, England is a battleground. It's a constant turmoil, a history of constant turmoil, what the essayist calls lurking darknesses. And you can say that those are, yes, within the land, but also in his, you could argue maybe in Stephen's mind, you know, in his psyche. And they also fuse in the story the concept of England and Christianity being one, and also the contradictions and the good and bad things of that idea are interlinked in this kind of sort of like William Blakean way. In fact, there's even one scene where they sing Jerusalem when he's leaving school, when he's graduating from school. And I think I find hauntology exists in really only two places in the world: England and New England in America. And why I think that is because of this Presbyterianism, the Protestant, almost Blakean concept of fusing the sense of self in these areas traditionally with that of this unique form of Christianity, you know, that developed very differently in England, and then it was transformed to New England. But I think I can't think of anywhere else other than England and New England where you have this hauntological, you know, phenomena to that degree.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com